Hello my lovely Misfitians, I hope this video is finding you safe and well. For today's tutorial, we are going to be painting together a watercolor galaxy. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this. So for step number one, the very first thing that you want to do is prep your space. And you can do this first by stretching your paper. Since I'm going to be working in a watercolor journal, I'm going to be using large art clips to secure my paper flat against the binding basically of my book. This is going to help me later on to prevent puddles of water forming on my paper, which will potentially affect our painting. So it's always a good step to go ahead and stretch your paper. Now, traditionally what you would do is just tape your paper onto a wooden board, but since my paper is bound into a watercolor journal, I will be stretching it this way. The next thing that we're going to do to prep our space is to mask out a section of our paper. So I recommend using masking tape to basically block out a rectangle on your paper. This is going to basically help keep your paper flat as well as make a nice sleek line around or border around your painting. And finally, the third thing that you are going to do to prep your space is to pull out all your supplies. Now, if you've been following me on this channel, you know that I am a huge supporter of making sure all of your supplies are prepped even before you start painting. And that is because watercolor, especially when you're working wet on wet, which we're going to be doing today, tends to go really fast and move really fast. So it's nice to have everything readily available to you in your space. So for this tutorial, you are going to need the following supplies. Now that we have step number one completely done, let's move on to step number two, which is basically to set up the framework of your painting. The first thing that you're going to want to start with is your lightest color. For me personally, I want to create a nice light blue kind of cloud texture in the middle of my painting. So with your lightest blue, I'm going to be using Horizon Blue from Holbein, watered down to more of a milky consistency. And I'm going to take this particular paint ratio and apply that in basically a diagonal streak of color across my page. The next thing that I'm going to do is add color to my corners. And I am going to be using Core Magenta for my side colors. And once again, I recommend mixing these into more of an inky / kind of milky consistency, and then applying this color onto dry paper. And finally, for this step, the last thing we're going to do is connect the sections. So while your sections are still wet on the paper, and this is very crucial, you want to work fast while basically laying down your framework of your painting. So while my light blue streak is still wet and while my magenta colors are still wet, the next paint that I'm going to be using is kind of a true blue or a deeper blue color, and I am going to connect both of my light blue and magenta colors together. And what I recommend doing is first placing this color on dry paper and then lightly kind of touching the edge of the colors that you have already painted. And what you're going to see happening is those colors begin to mingle and blossom together, which is going to create a wet on wet technique. Now, as you start to lay down color, remember that you can push your color around with a wet brush as well as lift or pick up color with a paper towel. So even though we are working wet on wet in this particular section, you still have some control as to where your color goes as well as how much is applied to your paper. So for this step, your main goal is to basically keep that diagonal stripe of light blue down the center of your page, as well as allowing the edges or the corners to slowly mingle together in purples and pinks and deep blues. Now moving on to step number 3, building up intensity. Since we have our framework basically set up of where we want our colors to be located, now we're going to be building up that color intensity by basically laying more color on top. So for this particular step, the first thing you're going to do is add paint to your already wet paper. And since our paper is wet, this new color should blend out in a wispy effect. Now with a wet brush, I recommend pushing the paint around to any location where you desire it to be located. For this section, I'm going to be using watercolor concentrates, simply because I really like working with them, plus they show up really nicely on camera. However, you can do the same effect with watercolor tube paint. Basically, what you're going to want to do is squeeze a little bit of your tube paint out onto preferably a deep well palette, and then dilute it with water until it's more of an inky paint ratio consistency. And then with a pipette, you can add that paint to your painting almost as if it's like a watercolor concentrate. So after allowing this kind of deeper blue to mingle upon my page and kind of just settle, I then took my magenta and then placed that over my pink and blue sections. And once again, since my paper is still wet, the blues on the page and also this new magenta paint should mingle together, creating mesmerizing deep blues and purples, which are going to look great as a galaxy texture. So go ahead and continue adding color until you are satisfied with what you see before you. Now, ultimately, your watercolor galaxy might look different from mine, and that is perfectly fine. Because let's be honest, the night sky has all different types of colors as well as star constellations. So if you add maybe more purple or desire more purples or more blues, or maybe you just want more teals and blues instead of the purples in your constellation or on your galaxy painting, feel free to do that. Basically, the main thing that you're going to want to be doing is just layering those colors on top of one another and building up the intensity in the same way that you see me doing here. Now for step number 4, we are going to be adding texture. And this is something different. I've never seen anybody do this per se in a galaxy painting, but I thought it would be a really cool effect to add to my watercolor galaxy. So the way I decided to add texture to this painting is by applying crinkled up plastic wrap to my still wet paper. And what you're going to do is lightly press down that plastic wrap over that wet paper and create an assortment of basically different shapes beneath that crumpled up plastic. Then I recommend setting it aside and allowing it to dry thoroughly. This took about 15 minutes for me, but it could take longer depending on the humidity in your environment. I would not recommend hitting this with a heat gun or a blow dryer because it's going to basically mess up the textured effect that we are trying to go for. So I highly recommend just taking your time and maybe going and making a cup of coffee or chatting with a friend while you wait for this particular element to dry and create that really cool kind of stained glass texture on your paper. Now for step number 5, we're going to repeat the last 2 steps again. So basically we are going to build up intensity and add texture once again. And one thing that you're going to start noticing as you work with watercolor is that when you're laying the color down on the paper, it tends to be a lot darker than when it dries. And this is because basically as it's drying, the color tends, not always, but tends to lighten just a tad as the water basically evaporates and the color soaks into your page. So for this step, basically you're just going to be hitting certain sections that you feel like need to be more intense or vibrant in color. Now, I will caution you right now, be very, very careful not to abuse your paper. This can be really easy to do if you add too much water or if you are rubbing your brush or even a paper towel along the surface of your page. Now, if you find yourself using too much water or having basically puddles of paint on your page that you don't really want, I highly recommend just taking a small little piece of a paper towel and then lightly dabbing it onto your paper and allowing that paint to just suck up into that paper towel. This is an easy way to lift up those basically excess paint and water puddles that are on your page without damaging your paper. Once you're happy with your galaxy colors, once again, while the paper is wet, go ahead and apply the plastic wrap on top and allow it to dry thoroughly. And now moving on to step number 6, which is adding our stars. And for me, this is the funnest part of this entire process. So what you're going to do is take some white ink. I'm going to be taking Copic white ink, but you are welcome to take any type of white ink that you have, or even diluted white paint. And you basically want to make it more of a milky consistency on your mixing palette, and then with your toothbrush you're going to splatter stars all over your paper, basically wherever you desire. Now, I highly recommend playing around with different ways of holding your toothbrush, as well as different angles of kind of brushing your thumb along the bristles. You're going to find that as you angle your brush different ways, you'll get different splatter effects. Now, for me personally, I liked holding my brush kind of at a perpendicular angle while above my paper, and then kind of flicking my thumb through the bristles upwards. This helped me create more of a dot-like texture of stars on my paper rather than kind of a splatter of little droplets. but play around and just kind of see what works best for you. Once you're happy with your stars, make sure to let them dry thoroughly before moving on to our next step. Now, for this step, we're going to be adding our little houses to the corner. Now, I recommend using a pencil to kind of outline where you would like your little homes to be located, just kind of to guide you as you go into this painting process. I place mine on the corner edge of my paper. And if you're curious as to how I drew these houses, make sure to check out my blog. I have a sketch there for you that shows more clearly the drawing that I put in this location, but it is really a simple and easy sketch to mark out on your page. After you have your outline done, the next thing that we're going to be doing is filling in our little houses. So the very first thing that I recommend doing is mixing up some blue and black paint color, or even you can use black ink mixed with some of your blue paint, and basically mixing up a nice deep navy blue mixture. This color should be more of a milky consistency on your palette, which is going to give our houses more of an airy kind of light look on our page. After you have your color mixed up, the next thing that you're going to do is paint the foreground of your houses. And this basically includes the hill as well as these two small houses located on either side of this triangle section. After filling in the foreground, the next thing that you're going to do is blow dry this section thoroughly. Then we're going to be painting the background, and this basically includes the trees as well as the large house located in between our two other little houses. And once again, you probably know the drill. Once you're done, make sure to dry this section thoroughly once again. Now, with a small brush, the next thing that we're going to be doing is adding a dark blue line to our roofs of our houses, our windows, as well as our doors. And with that same color, I recommend adding small little bushes to the front of your homes, as well as small little puffs of smoke coming from your chimney. Then with that same color, I recommend diluting it just a little bit. Go ahead and add some trees behind your large house as shown. And finally, step number 8, we're going to be adding final details. Now, this next step is totally up to you. You could actually stop right here, or you can add just a little bit more of creativity. It's totally up to you. I always like to add the option in my tutorials for you to use your own creative genius in your paintings and basically kind of make your own mark or put your own type of style into your paintings. So I challenge you to kind of think of different things that you could do here. Now, for me personally, I was inspired by Van Gogh's Starry Night, so I decided to add a little sky spiral to the background of my painting, and I basically did this by mixing up a deep purpley blue paint mixture and then diluting that down to more of a milky paint ratio consistency, and then painted that over top of my sky as shown. And then the next thing that I decided to do is just add a couple of larger stars with a small brush. And I use my Copic white ink, but once again, you can use any type of white paint that you have on hand. Now, a couple of ideas that I could throw out to you right now that you could do for yourself is you could create constellations in your sky. Or you could even put silhouettes in your sky, such as a bunny, a fox, or you could put a shooting star. Really, the options and choices are completely up to you, and they're really endless. So use your own creativity and kind of allow that imagination to become unlocked. And that is it. Once you're happy with your final painting, make sure that it dries thoroughly and then go ahead and remove the masking tape from your paper and admire your work. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please make sure to give a like and a share for this video, as well as subscribe to the channel. My schedule is going to be a bit wonky over the next upcoming weeks, especially since I'm planning on doing more of these kind of mini tutorials. So please make sure to hit the bell notification, as well as follow me on Instagram for more info as to when I will be releasing these videos. I can just tell you right now, I am most likely not going to be on a regular schedule. So if you could do a follow for me, that would be awesome. And also, if you do this painting for yourself, please make sure to share it with the hashtag on Instagram, I am a watercolor misfit. And that way I can use this hashtag to search for your work and see kind of your spins on a watercolor galaxy. So once again, thanks for watching and happy painting!